mentioned in his prayer, but Bone is not doing well, so I'm going to just agree once again. Just keep praying for him. I know he'd much rather be here than at home. We're going to continue our series of lessons of considering Christ. And really just trying to make it a point throughout our lives, throughout our days, to take time to consider Christ in all that we do. Consider who he is, what he has done, and what he continues to do today. And I really think that it would help change our lives. It would help us to be what we should be. But in this lesson, last week we finished up looking at Christ as considering him as Lord of our lives and what that means. This week we're going to consider the holiness of Christ. We want to consider the holiness of Christ. And we know that God is holy, as he states. He said, "Be ye holy as I am holy." We know that he is complete righteous, complete holy, complete right, complete just in all that he does. And Christ being one with the Father is also purely holy. So we're going to consider what that is, what that means, and what that means for us as we go through our lives, and we consider that he too is 100% holy. And we know that in the world today, a lot of people want to say and accept the fact that Christ is love, and God is love. We know that to be true. God is a God of love. Christ is one of love. But there's also a lot more. There's also a God and Jesus of righteousness, holiness. And because of that, he does some things that the world today would not consider love. And as we hopefully will get to it this morning, the things that Christ does out of holiness is because he's a God. And so we'll kind of look at that as well. But John chapter 2, beginning in verse number 12, we'll read through verse 22. He says, "After this, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brother and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and changes of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables. And said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple builded, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them. And they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now I know this is a very familiar passage, but we're going to attempt to look at it a little bit differently, I think. At least it was a little bit differently for me. Again, a lot of the passages the author of this book uses, I don't get right away when he's comparing it to the thought that he's trying to present, but he does make it pretty clear. I don't know, it's been good for me to kind of look at things a little bit differently, look at passages a little bit deeper. But we want to use this passage to consider Christ's holiness. Now, we know at the time of the Passover, they would go to the temple to give their offerings, to worship. And that's what Christ was doing. It was the time of the Passover, he was going to the temple, but as we just read it, that Christ encountered something he didn't quite like. The fact that they were using the temple as a place to make money, earn money, and not just that, the fact they were on the edge of stealing from others. They were charging, interest rates that were high above the standard. They were trying to make gain off people's travel, and we'll get to that, I think, later if we can kind of hit. But they were using the temple as a place for them to get personal, not to honor the Lord. Of course, this angered Christ, and we see him throwing over the tables, kicking them out, driving them out with a whip. And a lot of people would use that, well, that's not very love. But as we'll see, he's doing that out of love. But more importantly, he's doing it because he's holy. Christ entering the situation, he had to act upon what he saw. He couldn't let it go unnoticed. He couldn't let it go without saying a word. He needed to do something. Today, a lot of times, as we kind of stated earlier, the world, and I think a lot of Christians, we want to decide for ourselves what who God is. We want to decide for ourselves who Christ is. We want to kind of just pick and choose the attributes of Christ and God that we like, and or put better, the attributes that fit closely to the way that we want to live. We want to kind of dictate who God is, so we don't get in trouble for the things that we want to do. In lack of better words. The author of this book writes, our purpose is not to get God down to our level or our opinion. Our goal is to learn how to conform to his image. We need to understand who he is and how he wants us to live. And that's how it is. We shouldn't want to bring down God to our level. If we did that, then he wouldn't be God, and he couldn't really handle any of our issues today. But instead, we want to try to make ourselves more like God. After all, that's our mission as Christians, to be Christ-like, to form to his image, form the image of Christ. We know, and we're not going to go through all, he uses quite a few scriptures here to show that Christ is God. I think we all have that knowledge and understanding, that Christ is one with God. We may not understand how it's possible, but we know it to be true. The Bible is plainly clear that Christ is one with the Father. So we won't go through all those that he has here, but John 1:1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And of course, Word there, speaking of Christ, he plainly states that he is one with God, and he is God. So we know that God is holy, and we accept that God is holy. We also need to accept that Christ is infinitely holy as well. Excuse me. We know that Christ was grieved in the fact that he saw business being done in the temple. And of course, this put it into action. It made me think, how do we act when we come to situations like that? How do we act when we encounter things that we know aren't right? Whether it be in church, or hopefully not here, but maybe you're visiting churches and you see things that aren't scriptural. Maybe you see things going on in other people's lives, or your life, that aren't scriptural. Or you see things going out, and obviously every day, we see things going out on and about out in the world that aren't scriptural, that aren't right. How do we act? How does that affect us? Not only physically, but also spiritually as well. The first thing we want to look at is the assessment of the Lord. The Lord Christ walking into the temple, he makes an assessment of the situation. The author here breaks it down into a physical assessment and a spiritual assessment. How Christ physically saw the situation and how he spiritually saw and handled the situation. Now, he goes in to talk about the temple, and I don't know if you look at the temple very much, but the temple was about 750 by 750 square feet, which is 13 acres. You know what that is? That's very large. It's a very large area. It's something to behold. The temple wasn't just an ordinary place, an ordinary building, an ordinary area. It was something magnificent, not only in size, but the way the materials were constructed. And it was massive. And the whole temple was considered to be holy. It was a place set apart for them to worship God, to bring things that God was going to meet with them. It was a holy place, a place that was sanctified for the use of that purpose. Much like our church buildings today should be holy, they should be sanctified. They should be set apart for that purpose of worshiping the Lord. And again, there was definitely a great beauty to the temple. It was a sight to behold. It was something that people from all over would look at, and they would just be in awe and amazement of the materials, the time, the effort that it took to build. But we see Christ was more concerned with what was going on inside the temple, not the temple itself. We have a very beautiful building. We get compliments all the time, if you haven't heard. People visit this building, they comment, such a beautiful building. And it really is. The way that it was constructed, it's older, it has its issues, but it's a very nice building. But that's not the important part. If we didn't have this building and we met in a lesser building, that's not what's important. What's important is what goes on inside the building. What goes on inside the place that was set apart. A lot of places, people may go to a church that's small, run down, a building, and they pass it by or they write it off. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't base things on the outside appearance, but that's what Christ is doing here. He walks into the temple, and of course, again, he sees what's going on, and in fact, he didn't like it. I mean, we see that by his action. His physical actions there were to drive them out, to make them stop doing what they're doing. He used a little bit of showing of force. You need to realize that Christ was a man. He was human. But he was also doing it out of love because he was holy. He had to drive them out. He couldn't let these things go on inside the temple as we get further on. And again, how do we react? If we were in that same situation, how do we react? Some of us would probably get angry. But if we're honest with ourselves, our anger would be a lot different than Christ. We would probably try to drive them out or get angry, out of anger, not out of love. But Christ was doing this out of love, which is evident as the account goes on. When we looked at his physical assessment, and then he goes into a spiritual assessment. The purpose of the temple, again, was for people to come worship the Lord. The temple had a spot for the Gentiles to come and worship. And that purpose of that place was for Gentiles to come and ultimately be converted if it was the Lord's will. They would come worship, hear the truth, much like our church today, we are to preach the truth. People come and visit, we are to give them the true word of God. And that's what the purpose of the temple was. But now we see the purpose of the temple was lost. The Gentiles here were coming. And instead of those in the temple and those that are in the area giving them the gospel or giving them the truth, they were taking advantage of the Gentile situations. A lot of these Gentiles, they would have traveled some way. They would have come, they were from foreign lands, if you will. They had different currencies, and that's why the money changers were here, to convert their money into the money that was used in the temple in that area. Of course, they were charging interest rates and fees that weren't normal, that weren't right. So they were taking advantage. So again, we're interested in making a profit. And again, that made me think, what are we concerned with when we come to the house of God? Is it the building? Is it anything else? Is it the things of the world? I remember Ken's devotion a while back. Are we more focused on getting our minds and hearts right? Or are we focused on everything else? And it's not bad to have conversations. We should get along. We should be friendly with one another. It's not bad to have common interests and talk about other things. But is our main focus just getting together and socializing, or on the things of Christ? And that's what Christ is getting at here. The main focus for the temple should have been worshiping God. And Christ saw the opposite was true. It wasn't, not true. In 1945, again, he says, or Luke 19:45, he says, he went to the temple and began to cast out them that sold therein, and them that bought, saying unto them, it is written, my house is the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. The temple, the house of God, is to be a house of prayer, but they turned it into something that perverted, that should not have been. He saw greed going on rather than worship. And then I kind of think, and he brings out a little bit, but what would God think if he is in the midst of us as we worship? But if we truly consider that, what do you think he's thinking at any given time? Hopefully he's pleased with our worship. Hopefully in our hearts. Again, remember, God looks on the inside, not the outside. He doesn't care that we are in suits and ties and dresses and things of that. We should dress the best that we have. He's more concerned with our hearts, why we're here, what we're doing while we're here. what would he say? Would he be grieved in the fact that we've perverted the house of God to something it's not, or would he be pleased with our manner, method, and means of worship? He writes that we should do our best to keep our focus on the teachings of Christ. Sometimes we can get so lost in the activities of the church that we don't see Christ. Just imagine Jesus going to the temple, longing to enjoy sweet fellowship with his Father, and seeing what was happening. And again, that should make us consider how we come to the house of God. If we consider that God is holy, that Christ is holy, and we know that Christ is here when two or three are gathered in his name, we should consider that because he's holy, he needs to take action if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, he will. We see that when he chastises us. He not only chastises people individually, he does chastise churches, if the need is there. And then we see the second thing he points out is the action of the Lord. Again, the Lord took action. He saw the situation, he assessed the situation both physically and spiritually, and then he continues to take action. He had to do something because he was holy. What was going on was not right. Just like in our lives today, if we have sin in our lives, the Lord is going to take action eventually. It may not be right away, it may not be immediately, but he will take action. We cannot let sin go unpunished. The first action he took was one of confrontation. And of course, in our text here, he made the scourge of small cords with a whip. He drove them out of the temple. He chased them out. And a lot of times people picture Christ as somebody that was weak, that was a hippie type kind of man. But these people here, they were afraid for their lives, I would have to imagine. There was more of them than there was of Christ, but Christ made a whip and drove them out. He was taking action. And then he tossed over the tables, poured out the money, told the ones that were selling doves they needed to leave. But again, this too reflects the holiness of Christ. Not out of anger, as some would say, well, that's not very Christ-like. It's 100% Christ-like. He did it because he was holy, because he was right, because he was just. And then he gave them a word of admonition. He didn't just drive them out, take physical action, and toss it over. He gave them an admonition. I think a lot of times in our days today, we forget this part. We're quick to get angry. We're quick to take action. We're quick to kind of stand up for what is right in terms of, we'll tell you that you're wrong. We'll tell you that you need to get right. We'll say that. But we forget to give them the word of admonition as Christ did. And this is why I say that he did all this out of love. It wasn't out of just pure anger. Verse 16 again says, he said to them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. So not only is Christ telling them they needed to leave, chasing them out, he's telling them why. He's telling them, you're dishonoring the house of God. You're dishonoring the temple. You're making it a house of merchandise when it's supposed to be a house of prayer. He's explaining to them why what they're doing is wrong. I think a lot of times in our day today, especially myself, we just get angry. We take the action out of anger and we leave it at that. We never explain why. We never take them to the scriptures and say, here it is, and try to teach them. The Lord was doing both here. Jeremiah 7:11 says, is this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. So this isn't just a new problem in regards to the temple. In the Old Testament, God had to say pretty much the same thing. In our day and age today, I fear that it's still going on today. Hopefully not our church, but in other churches, other places of worship. It does happen. It's still an issue today. It's not something that we can just write off as, oh, it will never happen. It could very easily happen here. When they built the temple, I think those that were there, they probably thought, oh, that will never happen here. Oh, behold, it did. And I think we need to be careful saying those words because, as we reminded quite often, they're belied by the grace of God. we can very quickly fall into the same things. We know that worshiping God must be done in holiness and truth. But yet, we get so distracted when it comes to worship. We have so many things on our minds, so many things to look at, so many things to think about. It's easy for us to get distracted. And again, that's not just a knock on anybody. It's a human nature. We get distracted easily. We hear a noise, we see something shining, we get distracted. It's very easy to, and no disrespect to pastor by any means, it's very easy when we listen to pastor or anybody preaching to get distracted. As much as he may try to keep our attention, to keep us focused, to preach the word of God, it's human nature to get distracted. We need to fight against that. We need to not get distracted. And that's what was going on in the temple today. They were just distracted. They all knew the purpose of the temple, but when they saw, we can make a little bit of money. We can make a lot of money. We can put on our suits and ties and put on the show of worshiping God, but we can also use it for our gain as well. So their worship wasn't 100% at this point. Not that they weren't worshiping God at all. Not that they weren't there because they loved God, but they decided they were going to add to it. They were going to make themselves a gain as well. He says we are to set aside the sins and weight that so easily beset us. Of course, Hebrews 12:1 is quoting there, which says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does so easily beset us. And let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God." It's going with that. Our focus needs to be looking unto Christ, looking unto him, not looking sideways, left or right, up or down, but looking to Christ. That would stop us from getting distracted, I think. A lot of times we want to look left and right, we want to look up and down, we want to look everywhere else. But our purpose is to look into Christ. He uses this illustration, which again, a lot of these I think are really good, so I'm just going to read this part here. He says, Marlo Runyon was an American Olympic athlete in the 2000 Sydney Olympics. In 1996, she worked as hard as she could to qualify for the Olympic team, but her best time still fell short of the United States team. She continued to work on it until she made the team for the 2000 Olympics. That year, she placed 8th in the 1500-meter race and had the best finish ever for a United States woman runner. What makes Runyon's story stand out is her disability. Runyon is legally blind, and she was the first legally blind athlete to ever qualify for and compete in the Olympic Games. She believes that her hindrance was actually a valuable tool for her. She could only see the shapes and blurs, so she puts all of her attention on the finish line rather than the distractions around her. She believes that not being able to see distractions helps her to win a race. And I think that's true for us today. I think a lot of us would do well if we were a little bit blinded to the things of this world. If we couldn't see the distractions. She was running, and I don't like to run. I tried to run as little as possible in my life. But when we're outside, and you have a goal, even if you're walking to your destination, it's very easy to get distracted by a car passing by, someone talking, something going on. We want to know. When we're driving down the highway, how easy is it for us to look over at an accident that just took place? We want to see, we get distracted. And that slows down traffic, causes more accidents, and so on and so forth, but it's easy to get distracted. She said because she was blind and couldn't see those distractions anyway, the only thing she had to do was focus on the finish line, to look straight ahead. And that's what we should be doing when we out in the war, just looking unto Christ. If those in the temple were looking to Christ, looking to God, without being distracted with things of the world, Christ wouldn't have had to rebuke them in the manner that he did. But they were distracted. He writes, the Lord is holy, and he deserves your full attention and adoration. And that's true. He is 100% holy, 100% righteous and just. So he deserves 100% of our attention and 100% of our worship. We can't possibly worship God while we're distracted by the things of this world. We may think, well, we can do both. may be good, some may be good at multitasking better than others, but worshiping God is not something we should multitask in. It should be our focus. It's impossible to worship God the way that we should when we have other things on our hearts and our minds. It just doesn't work. He deserves our undivided, complete attention. 2 Corinthians 7:1 says, having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. We should be trying to perfect holiness. And I know in our human nature we cannot. It is impossible for us to be 100% holy. Well, it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Eventually, we'll be holy as God is holy. We will have that new body that has been renewed. But our goal on this earth should be as holy as possible. In doing that, we must look to God. And this is important when he writes. He writes, God is not calling us to live with a holier than thou mentality. But he does say, be holy, for I am holy, of course, according to 1 Peter 1:16. But he is not calling us to have that holier than thou mentality. I think sometimes a lot of Christians, and if we're honest, at one point in our life or another, we have maybe had that mentality. We think that we're better than somebody else. That they're doing something wrong, but we, well, I would do it this way. You should do it this way, like me, or however else we might want to phrase it. That's not what God is saying. God is saying not to look down upon them, but be holy as Christ is holy, as God is holy. We should be imitating Him. We shouldn't want others to imitate us. We should want to imitate Christ. Christ wanted the place of worship to be holy. He still wants that today. He wants the people who worship Him to be holy. And then he asks the question. If Jesus were to access your heart today, again, which He knows our hearts, we don't have to give Him permission to. But if we were to pray the prayer that David said, search me, see if there be any wicked way in me. But if you were looking at your heart today, right now, what would He have to drive out? He went to the temple, and we look at this and we're like, oh, we would never do that. We would never exchange money in the temple. We would never buy and sell this or that. We would never try to turn the house of God into a place of profit for us. But if Christ were looking at your heart today, I'm sure we could all think of one or two or several things that Christ would have to drive out of us. It may not be these same things going on, but it doesn't make our things any better than what they do. We know that sin is sin. We all have our issues. So we approach worship, we approach God, if we consider His holiness, that should really make us want to be more holy. Because if Christ is holy, He can't let sin in our lives go unpunished. We're told that He chastises those He loves. He brings us to the point of repentance, one way or another. If you're a true child of God, He's not going to let it go for very long. He's going to chastise them. He's going to make us repent. So we need to consider that He's holy. And then the third thing He looks at here, quickly, maybe over this, is the attribute of the Word. We know that, again, Christ is God. He's one with God. And because that He is one with God, He shares attributes with God. There's a second. First of all, we see that He is holy God. And again, we hit this point time and time again, so we're not going to belabor it too much more. But John chapter 2 and verse 17 in our text says, and His disciples remembered that it is written, thou zeal in thine house hath eaten me. Christ is showing His role as their King, the King of the earth, the King of kings, the Lord of lords. And He was 100% committed to holiness. He was angry, but He was righteous in His anger. Again, a lot of times in our lives, I think we're angry, where our anger is not right. We may think we're angry for the right reasons, but we're not. Christ here, His anger was warranted. It was out of necessity because He is holy. And He judged those in the temple that day. Because He was holy God, because He couldn't let that go unpunished, He took action right then, right there. But again, we fast forward till today, we have issues in our lives. He needs to take action. He needs to call it out, if you will. He will make us know of it. Psalms 96:9 says, "O worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Fear before him all the earth." We are to worship God in the beauty of his holiness. And we should fear him because he is holy. Because he can't let us get away with what we want to get away with. Because he can't let us live the way we want to live based on our fleshly nature. I think if we're considering the holiness of Christ, we'll want to live more holy. But if we don't, we're going to want to live the way the flesh wants us to live. That is usually the complete opposite of being holy. Christ cannot let that go unpunished in our lives. Another illustration he writes is Dan Edwards was a missionary to the Jews in the 1800s. After he was ordained to be a missionary, Robert Murray McShane, a Scottish pastor, wrote to him and said, "In great measure, according to the purity and the perfection of the instrument, will be the success. It is not great talents God blesses so much as great likeness to Jesus. A holy minister is an awful weapon in the hand of God." Of course, it often means great. It's not about being able. It's not about being looking the part, if you will. It's about looking more like Christ. And that's what God blesses. That's what Christ wants. That's what Christ desires in our lives. Psalms 138:2 says, "I will worship toward thy holy temple, and praise thy name for thy loving kindness and for thy truth. For thou hast magnified the word above all thy name." Christ is the name above all names. We know that. He is the one that we are to worship. He is the one that we are to imitate, to be like, because he is holy, just as God is holy. The second thing quickly he writes, or the second point that he makes, is that he is the everlasting God. 18 through 22 of our text says, "Then answered the Jews and said to him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said." Again, Christ was speaking truth. Those that didn't quite understand what he was talking about. But Christ is the everlasting God. He says, you can destroy this temple, this body, which they did later. But he said he was going to raise it up. You can't kill Christ. You can't get rid of him. He is everlasting. The Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. He was with God before creation, and he will be with God for all eternity. He is everlasting, as God is everlasting. And that also proves the fact that he is everlasting holy. He was holy before the foundation of the earth, and he will never cease to be holy throughout eternity. Psalm 16:10 says, "For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine holy one to see corruption." Christ can never be corrupted. He never will be corrupted. He is always holy. And because of that, as we've already looked at, he needs to do what someone holy would do. A lot of times we probably don't like the outcome. But he doesn't because he's holy. And he does it out of love. Because not only does he, again, he didn't just get angry at those in the temple. He tried to show them the right way. Teach them right. To show them that the house of God is for worship, not for other things. Quick. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1 says, "Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord." But who may abide in the day is come, and who shall stand when he is put pure? For he is like refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. We need to be purified as Christ is. We need to make sure our worship, our lives, are one of holiness, like Christ is holy. Again, consider the holiness of Christ this week throughout our lives. I think if we just take a few minutes of every day considering that Christ is holy, I think it would change the way that we live our life, the way we want to live our life, the way that we act and react to certain situations. That's right. So, Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for the day. We thank you for the opportunity again to have you be in your house. We thank you for our church, for this place that you've given us to worship, for the ones that make up the church, and for our pastor, for giving him the wisdom that he needs to lead, and the leadership, Lord, give us the hearts to follow. We thank you for being a holy one. We know that we don't always like the results of your holiness when it comes to chastisement or things that we do that you need to take action to, Lord. We know that it's right, it's just, and we thank you for it, so we know that we're better off if you correct us, Lord. We pray that you just help us to be like you, to be more holy, especially when it comes to our worship. When we come to this place with pure hearts and pure minds, we get focused, we get right with you, and we just take this time to truly worship you as we should. We ask you for your blessings upon the service again, just for those that are taking part, hope our voices are pleasing unto you, and the message that Pastor brings is edifying to you, Lord, and we glean something from it. In Jesus' name.